Hi, everyone. We're just going to give folks a minute or two to trickle in here, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we have a critical mass, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Julia Stein. I'm the Deputy Director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment here at UCLA School of Law. I'm really excited for today's conversation about the climate implications of the upcoming 2024 presidential election. I'm going to do just a second of stage setting here. So 2023 was the hottest year on record. 2024 is set to outpace that record. This February, we marked a full year of global warming surpassing the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that was a centerpiece goal of the Paris Agreement. This year, millions of Californians and people around the world were impacted by climate-fueled extreme weather events, which, as we know, are ever increasing in frequency and severity. And against that backdrop, Americans are headed to the polls in November. And there they'll be presented with presidential candidates who have taken really starkly different approaches to climate change and environmental protection. So what are the range of environmental policy outcomes following the election? And what could this election mean for climate progress internationally and America's role in that progress? What roles will Congress and the Supreme Court play? And how can California continue to be a climate leader regardless of the outcomes? And so here to help us think through these questions are UCLA law professors Ann Carlson and Alex Wong and California State Senator Henry Stern. I'm going to briefly introduce each of them, and then we'll jump into our conversation. Professor Carlson is the Shirley Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law and a faculty director of the Emmett Institute, and we're very glad to have her back on campus this year, following her several years of service in the Biden administration, first as chief counsel and then as acting administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which, among many other things, sets federal vehicular fuel economy standards. She's a leading scholar of climate change and air pollution law and policy and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Today, I'm especially looking forward to her insights about the role of the federal government under a range of post-election outcomes. Professor Alex Wong is the Walter and Shirley Wong Chair in U.S.-China Relations and Communications and a faculty co-director of the Emmett Institute. Before coming to UCLA Law in 2013, he was the creator and founding director of NRDC's China Environmental Law and Governance project based in Beijing. He focuses his research on the law and politics of Chinese environmental governance, Chinese climate policy, and U.S.-China environmental cooperation and competition. As someone who has thought deeply about the roles of China, the US, and others in the transition to clean technology, I'm really eager to hear his views on how the election's outcome could affect America's role on the global stage and international dynamics when it comes to climate policy. And State Senator Henry Stern represents the 27th Senate District, which spans portions of Los Angeles and Ventura County, and chairs the Joint Legislative Committee on Climate Change Policies. He has served in the California State Senate since 2016, and before that was an environmental attorney and a senior advisor to his predecessor in the Senate, Fran Pavley. And during his tenure in the Senate, he has worked on landmark climate and environmental legislation, including as author of last year's SB 261, which requires major companies doing business in California to disclose their climate-related financial risk. As a climate champion in the legislature, I'll be curious to hear more from him about California's role in a post-election world. So thanks so much for being with us today, all. I'd love to start this off with a little lightning round. So maybe you each could give us a minute or two on one big issue that would be top of mind for you after the election, if Trump wins and if Harris wins. And Senator Stern, maybe we'll kick this off with you.
I'm glad you started with me because my premise for this whole webinar is that I don't want to jinx anything, so I'm not even gonna. This is a hypothetical, I guess, because I don't think we're gonna have to go through this sort of what if exercise. I'm feeling pretty confident, and hopefully, yeah, the country sort of makes this a non-discussion. But okay, that said, my short lightning round point is just that California hasn't been relying on the federal government to address climate policy, and so we're the fifth largest economy in the world, and from our perspective, we may have to get creative about our legal and regulatory approaches, but the direction of not just our economy, but I think of the US economy is just charging ahead. So it's really, I don't know, I'm feeling actually optimistic despite the political headwinds that are out there, just because of what markets are doing. But that said, watching Europe these days is sobering to see, the potentials for headwinds out there that could actually slow down our global partnerships. I guess I just, markets are going to be determinative is my thesis, despite how crazy our politics can get.
I like the note of optimism to start. And Alex?
So I'll jump in here. So I guess one thing I'm worried about in the event that we see a return to the administration that predated Biden-Harris administration is Schedule F. And one of the reasons I'm especially worried about Schedule F is really I have two reasons. This weekend, you might have seen that the head of the Heritage Foundation, who really is the brains behind Project 2025, denies the existence of climate change. That's just stunning to me, but it's a reality. And I think Schedule F is in many respects aimed at EPA. And I think, so Schedule F, if you don't follow it, was actually instituted in the first Trump administration. It's an attempt to turn top civil servants into political appointees and essentially fire the best and the brightest in the federal government and replace them with short-term political hacks. I say that somewhat facetiously, but with political appointees. And I think EPA would be right at the top of the list. We saw EPA shut out of a lot of policymaking during the first Trump term. And I worry a lot about not only not having the expertise to work on climate policy, but also losing some of our best civil servants. So there's a lot more to be said. And I hope that Henry's optimism is accurate. But I do also want to say a little bit as we go on about the role that California plays and what the differences are between Harris and Trump, along with the Inflation Reduction Act and all the rules and regulations that have been issued by the Biden-Harris administration on climate issues.
Great. So, what I think about a lot these days is U.S.-China competition on climate action and green development. And so the two candidates, as we all know, have starkly different visions of that, right? So we know the Trump platform and the conservative platform is all about doubling down on oil and gas. And with the Harris administration, it'll continue the work that's been happening already on pushing the U.S. for green development. And why that matters as I think about U.S.-China competition is that China is forging ahead very quickly on renewable deployment, manufacturing. The U.S. is playing catch up on this right now. The Inflation Reduction Act is a great first move, and it's making headway, but much more needs to be done. And the idea that you would slow it down for 4 years would really be devastating for that competition, because it's not just U.S. is not doing this in a vacuum. It's trying to make its companies competitive in a global market against a absolute juggernaut in China that's producing EVs, solar, wind power, and all sorts of clean energy technologies, and a country that has a strategy that's all about energy security, jobs, and economic development through clean energy technologies. And so I think that's really top of mind for me. And then I think one other point I'll just make is this idea of, we're sort of living in the aftermath. I had heard Pete Buttigieg talking about the famous Reagan line about the 9 most terrifying words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I think what we're seeing right now with the elimination of Chevron, it's the aftermath of that long game, and I think Inflation Reduction Act represents a big jump in for the state. And I agree with the senator that markets will be essential, but the role of the government and also convincing the American public that government can take this big task and do the right thing and do it well, I think is something that is part of the big effort that we're going to have.
And Julia, let me put a finer point on my markets point. The markets and the government are becoming one thing. I think that's what's changing is the market itself is starting to reflect an interventionism. And so I don't know. They'll have to cut off not just their nose to spite their face, but if they want to kill the IRA, they're going to be hurting the whole country, including their own people. And that's the part where I don't know. It'll be already you're seeing Speaker Johnson have a hard time with it, right? He wants to go gut this thing and he doesn't know how because it's too good for us. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I'd love to dig in on that a little bit further. I mean, the IRA and IJO were such huge, signature accomplishments of the Biden administration and have spurred advancements in clean tech, green infrastructure. So, I mean, you've touched on this a little bit already, but I'd love maybe, Alex, if you could speak a little bit more and others about how the outcome of this election is going to impact American and Californian leadership in this space.
Sure. Yeah, so looking at some of the studies that are coming out, Inflation Reduction Act is not that old, right? It's only a few years old, 2022, and the stats coming out are really promising, right? So I pulled some of the numbers: 170,000 clean energy jobs, anticipated 1.5 million additional jobs over the next 10 years, over 100 billion in clean energy manufacturing investments. And to the senator's point, a lot of these benefits are in Republican congressional districts, right? 60% of all IRA-related clean economy projects have gone to Republican Congress districts, and then affiliated kind of private investments even more. 85% of those investments are in Republican districts, right? A lot of them in the Southeast, and so a lot that's really promising here. One thing to just throw on the table, I realize that we as environmental lawyers aren't that well versed in the impacts of a trade, tax, and national security law on the way all this is playing out. And again, just to hit on the China angle that I study, is that these things are having real consequences on the potential dynamics of IRA rollout. Lots of discussion about the tariffs on Chinese solar and EVs and batteries, and we have to be very careful to protect our own industries while not handicapping us and making it so that we are in a sort of vacuum and we can't compete in a global market. So I think that's something to really look out for in the next 4 years. Obviously, if Harris is elected, we'll have a chance to sort of iterate and work towards that. Obviously, if it's a different outcome, then it'll be a very different story.
Hey, Julia, sorry to drop off there. I'm having connectivity problems even though I'm at UCLA, so I'm not sure why. So if I freeze or disappear, that's why. But for now, at least I'm back.
And we're glad to have you back.
You missed my brilliant rejoinder, Anne. I was saying it's not the word markets, right? Markets are being determinative. I was saying that markets and government have sort of become indistinguishable in a certain sense, as industrial economics has sort of become.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can now.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry,
Yeah,
you're
you're back.
totally frozen on me. So this is a little
My bad.
awkward.
Now I'm the freezer. Okay, I'll sit tight. Julia, you go.
Okay, so just the politics are still weird because even though money is flowing, we're sometimes seeing representatives from those areas still arguing in favor of repealing IRA, though I do think that the politics are tricky. I think another difference between Harris and Trump, I think, is one that's very obscure but important. IRA has a lot of implementing regulations. And those implementing regulations are really important. I think it's safe to say that they are regulations that are as expansive as possible in making things like consumer tax credits available, even with some restrictions that are included in the bill itself. So you could see regulatory activity, just as you will for sure on the kind of more traditional regulation side. You could see it on the Treasury side. And so there are ways to mess around with the implementation of the IRA, even if it's not repealed. And I think you would see at least piecemeal attempts to repeal parts of the IRA, not the entire thing, because some of it is in fact popular. And there are some pretty powerful interest groups that care a lot about maintaining these investments.
Yeah, and Senator Stern, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to what this all means for California and how the state is thinking about kind of safeguarding IRA investment that is already coming its way, and what the state plans for, for the future.
Yeah, and look, we went through this exercise once before, so the idea of Trump proofing California's sort of regulatory and budgetary landscape, it's not a new exercise, but I guess the potential implication, I mean, to have to fill the IRA gap as a state is daunting. And we're already chipping away at that sort of self-determination in a sense by putting a bond on the ballot, by looking at beefing up the cap and trade program and making carbon pricing bigger. But yeah, I don't want to let my optimism become, get to ridiculous ends and saying that it would somehow be just as good for us, if not states without the kind of fiscal firepower we've got, to continue to put out carrots. And it's been, sticky carrots, if you will, as the sort of new approach under the IRA, right? We already don't have a lot of sticks, let alone twigs. They're just, Zan was referring to, there's smart regulatory policies. Take something like hydrogen, for example. If Treasury wanted to do those regs a lot worse, they could. They may actually, but we'll see. But yeah, without that kind of that trust that the science and the economics are going to be there on the federal side, it certainly puts a lot more strain on us. And that's everything from like our fish and wildlife biologists and people who are enforcing the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act folks. Our water board's going to be tip of the spear there, as well as our regional boards, and really exercising the outer limits of federalism. I mean, that's the place where I want to hear from you smart folks on this this chat here, is like how we know there are areas in law that are fraught with peril. I would argue that some of those have been particularly federal in nature, and that that we, even on the end of Chevron, for example, that it won't hit the states' rights side of things as hard. It may hit those areas where we tear off of federal law, and we can talk Clean Air Act in a bit, or some of these other sort of tiered authorities. But the underlying police power, I don't know. At least, whatever. This is partly a therapy session for me too. I keep telling myself we're going to be like, we have some footing somewhere, because if they're going to undercut that kind of power to look after our own health and safety in California, for example, if we couldn't regulate air or water pollution, where does that jurisprudence even go? It ends up into absurd places, and maybe I refuse to admit that it could go to those places, but it will take some shuffling. We've already started thinking through the vehicle side, and it could cause uncertainty in the markets at an interim level. But I guess what we're hearing, at least from the private sector, is they're desperate for us to just keep going, and that they really need to see steady California leadership at this moment to kind of be that that stabilizing sort of that guarantee, if you will. So that's sort of how we see ourselves, right? Is to be a bulwark against all this, and to tell the rest of the West, anyone else who's, I mean, it's broad, the impact we have. Even something like the low carbon fuel standard, looking at carbon intensities all over the world, right? Like, we have global reach, and I guess, I don't know. I think it'll be very tricky for a newly know nothing Supreme Court, as well as a presidency, to sort of undercut the real foundational constitutional footing that we have as a state. Definitely some statutory and definitely regulatory problems, but I don't know. I like to think we can survive.
Yeah, I'd love to get into this kind of the role of the Supreme Court, of Congress, of the federal government here more. I know this is a question that's top of mind for many, or a set of questions that's top of mind for many. And I mean, you know, the presidential administration is one thing, and we've talked a lot about investment and federal regulatory power. But you know, the Supreme Court being what it is, and then we don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be with Congress at the end of this election cycle. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about, I mean, really how much power and leeway the next presidential administration will have on climate policy, and where you see recent Supreme Court jurisprudence fitting into this discussion.
So Julie, I'm happy to jump in on that question. So regardless of who is president, EPA, potentially California, NHTSA, potentially the Department of Energy, potentially Treasury Department, are going to face some headwinds in the courts. I think we'd be naive to say otherwise. And I think all we have to do is look at the past couple of years on the Supreme Court. We are all familiar with the rolling back of Chevron and Loper Bright, but that's just one of many cases that tip the hand of this current court. So in addition to that, we've got a case called Corner Post that essentially obliterates the statute of limitations with respect to rulemaking. We've got enforcement limitations. We have seen the court stay the implementation of the interstate air pollution rule. That's air pollution, not climate. So that's even more troubling to me, that it goes beyond climate. West Virginia versus Ohio struck down the Clean Power Plan. It did so on major questions grounds. The basic idea of major questions is if Congress hasn't directly delegated to an agency particular power, the agency can't exercise that power at all. We've seen that in another climate case as well. We've seen the court strike down the Water of the United States rule in Sackett versus EPA. So just a kind of head-on assault on environmental protection and on the administrative state more generally. So that's why I think IRA is so important, because it's congressionally adopted. And the rest of the exercise of authority for much of our climate policy is coming from old statutes that Congress hasn't amended in a long time, particularly the Clean Air Act. So I do think we have to be wary. I'm nervous about whether the court takes up California's authority under the Clean Air Act to issue its own mobile source standards. I do think the court is likely to be protective of California when it is exercising that authority for conventional air pollution as opposed to climate. And California's been careful to draft its regulations to demonstrate that these are necessary to comply with air pollution standards in addition to climate. But it's going to be a bumpy road, and we're going to have to see just how far this court is willing to go in striking down policy, which is, again, all the more reason that we need policies like IRA. I will also say the bipartisan infrastructure law does a lot on climate, both for resilience and also for EV charging infrastructure, which to me is a big, big issue. You know, if you're, worried about EV adoption, getting the infrastructure in place is one of the best ways to start tipping consumers in favor of being willing to purchase EVs. And that's without regulation. That's just money being spent. And there's a lot of federal money going in combined with private sector money. So there are some things that will continue regardless, but I do think that the courts are something to worry about regardless of who is president.
Well, one question, I basically agree with Ann. I'm really worried about what's going on in the courts. One question is, would there be cases where the pulling of Chevron could go towards canceling bad environmental regulations? That might happen at some of the lower courts, but if you get up to the Supreme Court, I think all bets are off on that. But there's that possibility, because we remember Chevron itself was a case in which NRDC was trying to overturn something that was less environmental.
So Alex, I have a good example for you from the last administration, and that is under the Energy and Policy Conservation Act. The Trump administration issued what you might remember as SAFE 1 and SAFE 2. SAFE 2 was actually rolling back and then issuing very limited fuel economy and GHG standards for vehicles. SAFE 1 said that no state could regulate greenhouse gases coming out of vehicles because the agency said, this was NHTSA, my former agency, said that it was preempted by the Energy Policy Conservation Act, and it issued a rulemaking. And one of the first things we did when we got in was we rolled back that rulemaking. The agency would not be entitled to any kind of deference, I don't think, about its interpretation of whether the Energy Policy and Conservation Act preempts, for example, California from issuing mobile source standards. So I think that's a good example where if a new administration were to get too far out over its skis, it might get reined in because there's no longer going to be deference to the agency, particularly in a purely legal question like that, where you don't have a bunch of factual findings that are underpinning it.
Now you're starting to sound optimistic like me, though. So I'll flip it back, which is to say they have shown a total willingness to break with all precedent and, completely disregard what would be a sort of uniform application even of their own jurisprudence. So even if they went with their own ruling, they could probably find, contort themselves into some decision that, I don't know. We just seem to be, with this major questions thing, inventing precedent. And so I'll flip out of my optimistic, advocacy here and just say that, yeah. I mean, I like to believe what Anne's saying is correct, but I guess, we are planning accordingly. Like we are thinking about that. If that waiver goes, then what? But I think also people are fixating a little too much on just the presidential, right? Congress becomes incredibly important, and I think there's actually a chance that that Democrats take both houses, and if that happens, we could end up putting some actual certainty back in the law. I don't know if it would be directly a climate policy out the gates, but might actually have a double threat, at least in the House and the Senate, if not all three.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear you and Anne and Alex talk a little bit more about that possible scenario and kind of maybe dream policy outcomes if there is a Democratic Congress and a Democratic presidential administration. How far could we push policy and climate progress under that scenario?
You're going to make me now. Yeah, I got to keep tacking back because now I don't like to get too optimistic about the future, even though it's right in front of us. But I'll just say out the gates, my sense is that the future of climate policy is health policy, it's jobs policy, it's air and water quality policy. It's not necessarily trying to drive climate even as the headline every time, but it's about household energy costs, and I could see us not completely building on progress and putting, new regulatory authority in place and trying to lock some really substantial stuff in. But at least the package that it all comes in and the outcomes we seek, it feels to me like the national dialogue at least is starting to sound a lot. Well, I mean, if Alex was just describing to the east how things are based on energy security and jobs and health and things like that, not to say we'd be mimicking our neighbors there, but our politics are starting to line up that way a lot more so than sort of the 1.0 version of climate policy as such.
I might throw in, on an international front, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, Brian Deese, who was in the Biden administration before, has a proposal for a clean energy Marshall Plan. And it's an intriguing possibility, the idea that you would really make that a central aspect of foreign policy and try to build alliances and use American manufacturing to sell products for the clean energy transition around the world, what's a big difference between now and the original Marshall Plan is that there happens to be another country that's way ahead of us on the manufacturing. So you really, if we had control of, if the Democrats had control of Congress and the presidency, you have much more ability to sort of put in place the pieces that you would need to really compete on that, right? It's not a sort of open field where you can go sell to a sort of, places that have been decimated by war, as in after World War II. But now you have countries that are already for the last decade have been getting courted by Chinese state-owned enterprises and companies and getting a lot of product from them that work well and are cheap, right? So how does the US compete on that? I think part of it is not trying to compete on the old technologies like solar PV, but trying to innovate to the new things. That's really American strength, right? Go to the things that haven't been invented yet and try to really get ahead of this.
So I just want to add two things. One is, I think it obviously depends on the margins, right? We had control of the Senate, but we have a filibuster and we had a couple of senators who were not exactly climate hawks. So I just wanted to put that out there, that it really matters who is in the body. And I think it also matters whether the party is willing to reform the filibuster. Because I don't think anybody's projecting 60 senators from a particular party.
Correct.
We've talked a little bit already about the EV space and EV adoption, and I know CARB just released some promising numbers showing our emissions are decreasing, and reductions in the transportation sector are really driving that decrease. And so I'm curious about a couple of things here. And first is more specifically what the outcome of the election is likely to mean for progress on EVs. And then second, and we started talking a little bit about the waiver, but I'd love to dig into it more, how California can continue to chart a path forward, and what hurdles it might face in doing so post-election.
So I'm happy to jump in here in two ways. One is, and I think Henry was saying this earlier, but I want to reiterate it. Markets are moving toward EV adoption. The IRA is in place and it's not going anywhere quickly, at least. We have massive investments in EV manufacturing and battery manufacturing, huge competition from China with very inexpensive vehicles. And that's all going to happen regardless of who is president. I don't think you can stop that train. It might matter on the margins in terms of speed, and it might matter in the medium and heavy duty sector, which is where California is so important and such a leader. So I do want to just say that I think we're heading toward electrification regardless. I think we're heading toward it in the medium duty sector regardless. And there are a lot of things that California can do that are outside of using its waiver authority, including incentives and so forth. And one other thing, and I want to just stress this again, the Clean Air Act requires California to meet very stringent standards for things like ozone pollution. And we cannot in the Southern District of California, the South Coast Air Management Quality District in Southern California meet those standards without going to zero emission vehicles across the fleet. Put aside climate change. So, and we have special authority under the Clean Air Act to issue our own standards precisely to meet that problem. And that ought to continue regardless of who is president. And we ought to be stressing it over and over and over again, because it's federal law and federal standards that actually appropriately require Southern California to clean up its air. And the way we have to do that is to clean our vehicle fleet. One more point, and that is there's some really innovative stuff going on in the South Coast on what are called indirect source rules, super wonky, but really important power, where California is essentially taking those big stationary sources like warehouses and ports and rail yards and regulating the truck traffic that is attracted to those sources as a result of their existence. So the warehouses aren't polluters, but they're polluters by virtue of the fact that trucks come in and out to pick up goods, to ship goods, et cetera. And the Clean Air Act allows for the regulation of those indirect sources. So there's a lot of creative stuff California can do even without the waiver authority. It's not as good. I'd rather have the waiver authority, rather have EPA granting waivers, rather have the court uphold that waiver authority. But we're heading toward electrification and potentially toward hydrogen trucks, I think, regardless of what happens.
I mean, I still have to pinch myself that this is a real possibility. Like I wish I were just dreaming it. The notion that what's the case again, Anne, where they can go back, the statute of limitations being lifted? That one's the sleeper amongst them.
Corner post.
Yeah, on corner post, like to be able to go back into the 1970s and just say, oh yeah, we're gonna go revisit Congress, and just yeah, we should have called it unconstitutional all along, and I don't know, it's wild. But I agree with Professor Carlson. Yeah, and I think the pressure will force our politics to break some of those hard to reach goals loose. Right now, it's almost not necessary because there's so much tailwind. No one has to really make the hard decision on something like an indirect source rule, but I think the time's gonna come. And it does concern me though on the heavy duty piece. I do think that's like make or break next 3-4 years on whether whether America decides to get that first mover's advantage or whether we do cede that to the East, right? Like to Alex's point, I mean, if we're gonna be the next leaders, I mean, we built Tesla off the Clean Air Act waiver. I mean, the ZEV credit market that we built using that authority got cash flow that company and got them off the ground. Is the next Tesla for trucking, which we feel like we're on the verge of kind of getting over that leap, and then all the rest of the OEMs chase. And we know the way these market trends go, which is why I'm still really confident on the OEM side on light duty that they're just not gonna want to have a big, maybe some tinkering, right? Like maybe some slowing and who knows, but on the heavy, it doesn't feel like there's a real electrification decision yet that has been made at a global scale. And I think we're on the brink of it, and we just need CARB to keep charging ahead on it. So that one does scare me. Certainly more than the light duty side. Like I could see us inking even just more of these sort of Stellantis type deals where we're sort of just doing direct to private MOUs that they want it to be enforceable, like that they're going to need this stuff. So I could see that happening, at least for the majority of the OEMs. Maybe not, maybe Toyota decides to be a rotten apple again and try to throw it all off and pull others with them. But I think the majority are there on light.
And I'll make another comment related to the tariffs issue, right? Tariffs on EVs and batteries. I think the next administration, if it's a Harris administration, to think very carefully about not just having sort of tough measures against China, but thinking creatively about how to both improve American industry, but also to accelerate deployment, right? So just the thing that's gotten probably the most attention from the Chinese market is the idea of the $11,000 BYD electric vehicle, right? And, imagine if something like that were, a decent quality small car were available in the US, and the possibilities for that low cost EV. I think we should be very careful about the tariffs on batteries, because China absolutely dominates batteries now, and to cut us off from the potential use of some cheap, good quality batteries that can be dangerous. But I understand the importance of trying to build these industries, and also this idea of supply chain resilience is a really important topic. How do you people in Washington, D.C. are talking about friendshoring and how to build supply chains with friendly nations, these sorts of things. But I think a lot more needs to be done on it. I think the main measure has been the sort of the tough kind of tariff, but then we now have to figure out how to make the smart adjustments to make it all work.
When finding a different relationship that's not so one-sided and sort of in this like, the whole world has to be careful what they say to China posture versus, okay, if we've got 40% of the market or 30% of the market in the US, like, okay, maybe China's still the dominant manufacturer out there, and that's okay, but it's one thing to have 60% of the market, it's another to have 99. right? And so I think that's the equalizing that'll hopefully then from that, and as the IRA sort of takes steam and American manufacturing actually does get to that place, the need that jingoism and all that kind of extra stuff starts to become less salient in our politics. And actually people are like, wait, but I want my jeans to be cheap. So like, I mean, even now you're seeing even the Harris campaign attack the Trump tariff plan as a constructive 20% sales tax, right? So there are limits to how closed the American consumer is going to be willing for us to get. And as soon as someone gets in one of those BYDs and drives around, it's like, yeah, people are going to start to demand it, right? So we'll see. Maybe that looks like, new partnerships, assembling goods. We've seen it work with those folks in the past. We've actually had some successful partnerships in the LA area in particular on the manufacturing side. And so it's just, but it's hard when you're, on the one hand trying to build a bridge, and on the other hand, there's bombs going off. So you're like, okay, let's land a new diplomacy here while there's, constant cybersecurity threats, financing, whatever, the darkest, worst things out there. And so maybe is the hope on my end is that some of the global geopolitics also calm down and we back away from this sort of further militarization and escalation. And so everyone just says, you know what, it'd be a lot more profitable. We all just got back to like getting the economies good and maybe not having wars on 2, maybe 3 fronts. So, but I don't know. Again, that's like where reason you hope prevails.
Right. And I'm hoping that there'll be more openness to just looking at joint ventures or partnering with some Chinese manufacturers here in the States. You get the benefit of the tax dollars and the jobs. Right now, there's serious discussions and concerns about security and other things. But to your point, if you can take, and it's become an issue on the presidential campaign, right, with Vance going to the battery plant in Michigan and making it a campaign issue. If you could take that temperature down a little bit, there's benefits to learning from those manufacturing deals and, trying to balance the things we want without driving away technology that could be useful.
I feel like steel with the Japanese, if we land that, then, you start to like step at a time, right? And it's just, it's one of those things that all has to be talked about in December. It's just a hard moment right now to do anything rational. Everyone's just on sort of, high alert. So hard.
Yeah.
We're talking a lot about markets in the private sector, and I want to come at it from a slightly different angle too, and talk about greenwashing and and its impact on climate progress. And Henry, I know you've had a little bit of experience in this space, so I'd just love to talk a little bit about the role that corporate climate accountability can play in the years ahead, and how much the election stands to influence that space.
I'll go first, but I am curious if either of you have thought about this work too, and not even just on the greenwashing part so much, like false advertising and overly self-congratulatory 10K filings and just on the corporate side, everyone wanting to be green. The green hushing concerns me, that they're actually corporate America in particular is nervous to say anything because they're going to get caught in the political crossfire, and that ESG is a dirty word now, and that carbon has somehow become conceived or litigated, in fact, now as a form of political speech. And so the fear is that the new front in the war against the sort of regulatory administrative state and in climate in particular is through the First Amendment. So they're suing us, U.S. Chamber and Cal Chamber are suing us right now over the laws Senator Wiener and I helped write on corporate climate disclosure, arguing, and this is, by the way, Scalia's son arguing this, now working in the private sector, but arguing that somehow this is compelled political speech to have corporations disclose material risk data. It's a little different argument than what they put at this SEC, which was a lot more rooted in that sort of West Virginia and Chevron and sort of that non-delegation concept. But this one's more like, you know, states can't tell corporations what to say, and this is not data, this is speech. And so if they can erode that, I think we're going to have trouble. But that said, just like my point for the other one with the private sector wanting certainty, we're hearing, I mean, we were just in New York last week and meeting with the biggest banks in the country, in the world, some of the biggest retailers, and, you know, all these just global giants all saying we need some safe harbor in a US jurisdiction that actually wants us to do this and has a uniform process for us doing this, because otherwise, you know, we're sort of stuck in this scary political back and forth as a country. And so the idea here is that California can provide a mooring, if you will, to these big ships to say, okay, if you're in the US, you know, hitch up here and do your disclosures here, and it'll count for Europe too, and Singapore and Hong Kong or whatever markets you're in, and that we can create some better sort of carbon accounting and data principles that will inherently stimulate progress, because folks are actually going to get credit then for what they do, but also just get a lot of the hot air out of the system. So we're really optimistic about it, and have already started discussions with some of the other jurisdictions around the world who are doing this. And so we're going to keep doing our thing on that front, and we're not looking to the feds for that work either, right? We're talking to the Europeans, we're talking to the Australians and the New Zealand folks, and reaching out to Singapore and Japan. So that's another one where we don't have to sort of just wait on the Congress, but like I said, that First Amendment kind of Damocles is out there, and so part of the goal is to get the U.S. Chamber to actually listen to their members, maybe stop trying to take this to a very dangerous place of precedent.
I would just add a couple things. I totally agree with Senator Stern that California can act here and it doesn't need the feds, and we just get into a lot less of the concern about preemption and how much permission you need from a federal agency, et cetera. And then the other thing I wanted to just highlight is that there are a lot of consumer lawsuits being filed now on some of these half-baked claims about climate progress by particular companies, and those are in state court. And that means that you don't run into all the problems with Chevron, et cetera. You have a more friendly judiciary in the state of California, I think, to hear consumer protection claims. So that'll be just interesting to watch what happens over the course of the next several years. I don't expect that will be affected by who's in the White House. It'll be, you know, more what's going on in the courts and what cases are being brought and how strong are they.
And just put a finer point on that one. I mean, those cases Ann's talking about are they're not even climate cases, right? They're not even they're not about environmental laws. They're about unfair business practices, false advertising, consumer protection, fraud, things like that. So we're not even, again, not climate as such. It's just like my Delta flight said I was carbon neutral. Is it? Oh, turns out no. They just bought some random piece of paper that actually delivered no reduction. So.
And I just add that the idea of getting better scope 3 emissions, right? So getting upstream and downstream emissions will be really important. As you know, we know how complicated and global supply chains are, and to get a better beat on that and to try to shape behavior elsewhere in the world through that will be useful.
Well, and that's maybe one place where the corporate leaders can actually help stitch together gaps in the carbon landscape that right now our politics don't really let the bigger national or international conversations occur. So like in Chinese markets, for instance, where a lot of things will begin in the supply chain, whether it's your phone, your jeans, whatever it is, you know, we're already seeing behavior change and an interest in clean energy buying from the major tech manufacturers all over the world who do business in black box markets or jurisdictions, right? Like they're in a lot of places. And so if they can get the data better, and not just the data, but like the buying demand better on what the materials are, you know, what the mining practices are going into it, what the energy being delivered. So they want to get the carbon intensity, in other words, of their supply chain down on that scope 3 side. They may end up doing a lot of the heavy technical legwork ahead of where governments are right now, and then set us up. I don't know, you could picture by a COP30 in Brazil, able to kind of really link and get things going. And even if not, even if things go horribly and it's not ready for 30, it still keeps happening enough that like they demand the certainty of an international kind of carbon accounting rules that work.
I'm cognizant of wanting to leave some time for audience questions, of which we have many good ones. So I'll ask just a couple of quick questions to close us out. And the first one is, and maybe Senator Stern, I'll ask you to go first here, and what California and other states can be doing now to prepare for what's coming after the election, kind of regardless of who wins.
We got to get projects done here. So we do have we want to spend down and obligate as much of that IRA funding as we possibly can. And we've left some money on the table, which has been a little bit disappointing in the state. Some big ticket stuff like on arches, but certainly not enough on the manufacturing side or on things like virtual power plants or some of these clean energy financing authorities. So I think there's a push to, between now and December, like contracts are being delivered right now. Loan Programs Office just pushed out $2 billion, I think, last week. Like, this is not a sort of just a quiet time on that front. So project execution is a biggie. And then, just as we've already done really good job on our rulemakings in terms of just having like equal footing, a lot of strategies in there and severabilities and sort of structures that can take, hopefully can take hits from the federal side. But I think we're still kind of going through that inventory too, and really understanding, what Trump proofing is going to look like. And we may have to run some legislation on that front in the coming year.
On the international cooperation side, California does so much work with other countries and has been a leader in sharing the way California does things with other countries. So, one of the things that California government has already been doing is sending the signal to places like China that even no matter what happens at the presidential level, that the work continues at the subnational level. So I'm affiliated with, Jerry Brown started this California China Climate Institute a few years ago, and that organization just held a subnational meeting in May to meet with a few thousand people to say, bringing other states in, bringing lots of partners from China and other parts of the world, and just saying, look, there's still going to be action and cooperation going on no matter what happens at the presidential level, and let's keep it going. And so, again, to the senator's point earlier, it's not like we can pretend that it's not going to matter not to have the federal incentives, but there's a path to kind of sustaining as much as we can, no matter what happens federally.
Anne, any thoughts here?
And Anne's never going to leave California if all this happens. That's our other backup plan, is we get to keep Anne forever.
I think it's secession.
Do not say it. This is you had to do it.
I don't really have anything to add. I mean, we've covered a lot. And, I think California is thinking strategically, as it did in the last, version of a Trump administration, about how it can maximize its influence, and it will continue to do that. And, again, I will just weigh in one more time on the medium and heavy duty truck side. That's the place where I think we really need to think about how do we keep the momentum going there.
Okay, well then I'll close on, maybe we can do a lightning round with this one too, but we've talked about some big differences between the two possible administrations. And I know a lot of people think of the two potential administrations as being diametrically opposed when it comes to climate policy. But I'm wondering if there are trends that you think won't change regardless of who wins. And I know we've talked about a couple of them already today in the markets, but I'd love to hear if there are others.
I mean, it continues the thread from earlier, but not just on sort of international policy and this sort of industrial politics, if you will, industrial nationalism that feels like it's becoming sort of the drumbeat, here. Now Europe has not just an industrial, not just a Green Deal, but a Green Industrial Deal. So I think that sort of friendshoring, sort of boosting domestic manufacturing, big hit on jobs is going to be there. The downside that I also see, though, is a doubling down on oil and gas as in this country, certainly. And you've seen that in the vice president's take on fracking, and that the sort of supply side of things, it just, I don't see us, I could see actually, becoming a more pro-fossil layout than even we saw early on in this Biden administration, where they showed a willingness to kind of review some of the federal leases and kind of push on that. Now we'll see. The world could look a lot different in a couple of years, and maybe it won't be necessary, and there won't be a war with the second or third largest oil and gas producer in the world, right? So, but who knows? It may be that this ends up being the path to climate certainty, is that the U.S. sort of takes the laboring war on oil and gas production and says, we're going to try to cut out the bad actors and not rely on them, do the work ourselves on the oil and gas, and then have control enough so that when we do have enough supply of EVs and sort of alternatives out there, that we can have the hands on the dials to be able to ratchet down too, and not sort of put us on a collision course. It's a high stakes gamut, but I see us actually taking more ownership on the oil and gas side than we did even last presidential.
So I just want to re-emphasize what a huge win the Inflation Reduction Act is. And that's my optimism, because I don't think Congress will roll back. I think there are too many interest groups that care. There's too much money that's pouring into, tech and all the rest of it. The American Petroleum Institute is in favor of the hydrogen tax credits. I mean, so when you start looking at the alignment here, and as Alex has already pointed out, lots of money going into red states. I think it's gonna be really, really hard to roll that back. And it is the biggest climate policy the federal government has ever adopted. It's huge. It's bigger than the regulations. Regulations are super important, and they push us farther, faster. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the IRA is an enormous accomplishment.
And I just add that I think what has me optimistic is I think this clean energy transition is just happening. Right? One of the stories I raise with my students sometimes is when you look at LA air pollution history, and students are surprised to find that one of the sources way back when was these backyard garbage incinerators that you still kind of see the remnants of sometimes in people's backyards. And I firmly believe 20 years, 30 years down the road, we're going to look back at the way we produce energy and transportation now and think of it in the same way that we think of those backyard incinerators now. That we understand that at the time you kind of had to do it, but it seems shocking that we ever got our services by also at the same time producing sort of life-killing pollution at the same time.
Thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to go to a few audience questions. There are many good ones, and I don't think we're going to be able to get through all of them, but I'll start with this one. We had a couple on Project 2025, and I know you've looked at this. And so, what are the aspects of Project 2025 that will have the most tangible impact on Americans' environment and health?
So I think there's a big question about whether Schedule F really ever gets implemented. So for me, Schedule F is one of the most chilling parts. There are so many chilling parts, but I think Schedule F has the capacity to absolutely decimate the federal government, not only because it would take away senior leadership and people who have extraordinary experience and talent, But it's hard to imagine what it would do to morale in those federal agencies. And I think we'd see an exodus in federal service by a lot of the most talented people. And that has lasting effects beyond any presidency. Another one that chills me is we know that Project 25 is all about rolling back every climate policy, but it's also about rolling back air pollution policy. And that, you know, the proponents of Project 2025 think we've already done enough to clean the air and we've already done enough to clean the water. And so, for example, they're recommending that we no longer set health-based standards, or we stop doing that. So we know, for example, that every 10 parts per billion of ozone in the atmosphere kills more people. We know that the standards probably aren't set tight enough yet. There are all kinds of hazardous air pollutants. All that stuff is going to stop too. So it's really a wholesale assault on environmental protection. But again, I think the Schedule F one for me, and maybe it's coming out of the federal government. I mean, as I like to say to people, the best kept secret in Washington, D.C. is the talent in the civil service. It's extraordinary. Nothing happens without them. That's, you know, the flip side of Schedule F is the any new administration actually needs the talents of the civil service. And if you cut the civil service, you're going to hurt yourself. It's going to be a lot harder to get anything done without those talented people who are at the top of the GS scale.
You know, one thing I might add, when we were doing our environmental law class last semester, we just went through the micro level kind of rules changes of, you know, just all the kind of things that don't rise up to the level of making a headline. And there's just so many of them, even in the last administration. So I think the concern is that they're going to be, well, you know, have had practice essentially, and will do it more aggressively. And the amount of labor and energy that's required to just deal with all of that. You know, first of all the environmental groups and will be playing defense for a long time. It's just a tremendous absorption of resources in an unproductive way, in my view.
We've talked a lot about climate investment, about the importance of the IRA. So we have one audience member who asked what funding streams for local climate action will be most durable in an administration change.
I think we said it, right? The money. That's what lasts. Again, unless they're just so ideologically committed that they're just willing to lose money. I don't know. But again, these things are possible. I don't know. I just, it's hard to understand this stuff. And you know, I don't know, do we go into a sort of a wholesale change on what federalism even is, and it just becomes a whole states' rights push in general in this country? You know, my hope, again, as I said at the outset, the U.S. Constitution will be the most durable thing, and that'll hold. But you know, at the margins, it is dangerous. I mean, just look at the recent stay even of the cross-state air pollution rule, right? Like, it's a good neighbor. It's good neighbor policy. It's literally something you'd be like, oh, this is federalism working great, because it doesn't matter if you're red or blue. Like, your next door neighbors, you probably shouldn't blow your NOx into Ohio. But it's sort of they want to make it like everyone for themselves, it feels like, almost. And so the hope is that the U.S. Constitution will be the most durable thing here. Is that too chilling?
Depends who's interpreting the Constitution.
Yeah, exactly.
I do think that one lesson out of the past 4 years is, and I know this is super hard, but is, boy, if you can pass legislation. I mean, the whipsawing of rules and regulations over the course of this began long before the Trump administration. I mean, the George W. Bush administration denied California's waiver to regulate greenhouse gases from the tailpipes of automobiles, and then Obama restored it, and then the Trump administration rescinded it, and the Biden administration put it back into play. I think the Harris administration would pretty clearly keep it going, but if you saw Trump come back into office, it would be withdrawn. I mean, that is no way to run a railroad. Henry was talking earlier about the need for certainty. It's a lot more durable if you can get Congress to actually act. So it kind of comes back to this question about, what happens if the Democrats were to win the Senate, the House, and the presidency. And I agree, I don't want to get greedy here, and I think we should be careful here. But I think the importance of legislation, Obamacare is a great example of this, right? It has really lasted despite extraordinary political controversy over it and attempts to repeal it repeatedly. So I'd sure try to put a lot of eggs in the legislative basket if I could.
I'll just add, I hope that the consumer incentives will stay, right? I mean, there's a lot of need for conversion of homes and, to get heat pumps and, for people to get electric vehicles. Right now, it's, as someone who's trying to take advantage of the incentives for home heat pump purchases, it's not as easy as it could be. And I'm a pretty motivated consumer. So hopefully in the next couple of years, if this continues, that just the systems will work themselves out, and it'll just kind of very smoothly, because there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Yeah, they've shown willingness. I mean, look, if it's popular, they don't want to kill it, right?
Yeah.
So if everyone starts loving heat pumps in the next, I mean, this is going to happen relatively fast too. It can't be like 3 years. Everyone says, next time my heater breaks, I'm getting, like I'm going to get the gas one and then I'll go.
Yeah.
But if we can hit on some of these buying trajectories, and on the EV side too, like if we can keep up the buying patterns that, as we've seen, they don't want to be unpopular.
Yeah.
So I think consumers have a lot of power here.
Alex, maybe this next one's for you first. Could you speak a bit to what might happen if a second Trump administration goes further than its past withdrawal from international leadership on climate change and actually withdraws from the Framework Convention on Climate Change entirely?
Right. So I think, as people know, Trump pulled out of Paris, but because of the withdrawal rules, it didn't really happen until the very end of his term. There's debate over whether the president can unilaterally pull out of UNFCCC. Right. I think I'd like to side with people like Harold Koh and others who say they can't, that there has to be reciprocity. What allowed you to get into it, you have to do the same thing to get out of it. But some people think the president can just pull out of treaties. I think if that were to happen, I mean, there's some the obvious big things like we already know happened. The tremendous hit for U.S. reputation and respect. It allows China to be framed as a climate leader, even though they're by far the biggest emitter in the world. I think less known thing, it'll have some impact on some funding streams, right? U.S. contributions to Green Climate Fund and things like that, or even just funding to the operation of the system would presumably cease or go to very low levels to make it hard to just do the work. And so I think it's not great, and obviously it would be hard to get back in, right? Because you need, if you were to actually withdraw and you needed the Senate approval to get back in, then it's not clear how that happens in this day and age, right? It happened back then in the early, in the 90s, but so I think that's out on the table as something to be done, and it's just it wouldn't be great.
Okay, one more question. And we'll make this our last one since I know we only have a couple minutes left. How valuable are climate-specific pledges and plans when compared to the other economic or international policies of each administration? Will our domestic or international policies have more weight in the long run?
I wasn't totally sure I understood the question. But
I think what this audience member is getting at is whether, are making specific pledges internationally or adopting legislation that's oriented at emissions reduction goals is more valuable than the kind of investment related policies that we've seen kind of be a feature of the past administration, and how that could play out both domestically or internationally.
So one take I have on this is that they're really intertwined. And that the administration pays a lot of attention to the commitments that it's made globally. And you see in the way that the conversation is spun, we're close to meeting our 2030 goals, right? And those, so I think those goals are super important in getting, on paper, even though they're not binding in any way, a domestic commitment to, and obviously not across political parties, but certainly by the party that has agreed to them. I think it does a lot to really cement kind of the commitment. It may limit the commitment too, right? It can flip in both ways, but I think it's surprisingly important, given that those pledges and commitments are not binding, and nothing will happen if you don't meet them, except that the planet will continue to warm. So, the investment commitments are connected to the pledges. The IRA is not, we don't look at it in isolation. It's partially super ambitious in order to meet those commitments. But I do think one other kind of observation might be worth making. That is, I think one of the reasons that the IRA was so ambitious is because the youth climate movement really expanded our horizons about what was possible. I think having conversations about, Henry said this earlier about what climate policy might look like going forward, but those conversations about things like the Green New Deal, which was politically very controversial, never went anywhere, still made people think differently about climate as something that's not just an environmental policy, but it's a jobs policy and it's a health policy, and it's all of those things. It's an industrial policy, and the IRA kind of reflects that. Even though it doesn't look anything like the Green New Deal, it does embody this sort of very ambitious commitment to transforming our economy at the same time that we tackle the climate crisis.
I would say on the international targets, I think there's a lot of frustration with the COP process and the UN process, and the feeling that it's a lot of effort for not a lot of payoff. But I think it's worth saying that the premise of the Paris Agreement is working, right? Which is, the idea was to have a disclosure kind of pledge and review system to periodically review, and that at each step you would see a change in the on the ground circumstances, and that you would make further pledges, right? We're going to see new pledges coming up this coming year from all the countries, and the world looks really different in terms of green technology than 2015. Right? It's a completely different world on EVs, solar, wind, batteries, these types of things, and we can make more commitments. So I think that part of it's working, and it definitely is. And then now we're in that phase where it's what happens at the domestic level, right? So we have to implement it, but that overall process of ratcheting everyone forward has been working.
And I guess I would just close that one out by saying, to Anne's point, you cannot put there's no way to overestimate the political demand. And if there is, it's even bigger than consumer demand, right? And depending on how voters behave, not just in our country, but across the world, I think, you're going to see, you'll see what this change in sort of domestic politics, if it can survive, sort of reform itself through this greater closing of all these sort of global markets. Like, globalization is not the thing anymore, right? No one's talking about free markets and free trade, and yet to somehow out of this political trend, can the new domestic initiatives get solid enough footing that they actually become something steely, literally, right? Like physical, that is strong enough to withstand whatever the political hurdles are that we're going to see both in this election coming up, or we're going to have to make it through a decade here, right? We got to, like, our spend time is like through this next decade. And if we can do that and sort of just push it through, in theory, we could sort of survive whatever is coming. But I don't know. It's I'm very, very anxious at the moment, and I watch Europe, I watch Canada, I mean, we watch very closely what's happening in these other countries, and I think there's sometimes a self-certainty we can get on the left, at least, that like, of course it's all, you know, of course there's always going to be climate voters, and of course we're going to be able to sort of transcend, because the morality of it is sort of it's self-evidencing. But I think we're realizing that's not true, right? You got to be able to deliver on like very less high-minded, very everyday bread and butter kitchen table stuff. But that's the grand maturing, I think, of what the climate movement's going through right now. It's like, we're going to go win an election with an electorate that is ever focused on just themselves, right? And what is my home like? They don't have time to worry about the world. They just got to pay bills. And if we can win on climate through these terms, we're going to do it.
Well, I join you in your anxiety. Thank you to all three of you for your insights and your expertise today. I know we're a minute over, so I'm gonna thank everyone for joining us, and send us all off into the
Thanks a lot.
election. Please vote.
Go vote. Yeah.
Thanks,
Julia.
everyone.
Thanks,
All right.
everyone. Bye-bye.